webinar today afternoon. I'm very pleased to meet you all today. At the moment, we have an audience of 32 people, but I understood that there are already 90 people registered for the webinar, which is great. I'm also very pleased to have with us Alondra Carrillo, Laura Roth, and Phoebe Martin, their biographies, which I will introduce before their presentations, foreground, very interesting different pathways to understand new forms of feminisms, activisms, struggles, resistance, and feminized politics committed to articulate feminisms as counter-hegemonic political projects to neoliberalism and beyond patriarchal capitalist coloniality. Just to put a little bit in context, this seminar, the reason of why this seminar, and on 25th October 2020, Chileans overwhelmingly voted to abolish Pinochet-era constitutions and to have a new Chilean constitution born in democracy and drafted for the very first time in the world by a constitutional convention with gender parity. On a transnational scale, the Chilean feminist movement is in tandem with feminist struggles elsewhere, experimenting with alternative forms of organizational power, feminist radical democracy, and new ways of democratizations of the urban commons to reclaim politics for the many, to collectively deliberate alternatives from below, alternatives to neoliberalism from below. This webinar seeks to reflect on how the Chilean feminist movement has become one of the key driving forces of the 2019-2020 Chilean protests and its role in co-weaving a feminist constituent process to write a new Chilean constitution. This webinar also invites our speakers to discuss and reflect on how this struggle, along with contemporary feminist movement elsewhere, are offering ways to understanding and articulating feminisms as a potential, historically distinctive, counter-hegemonic political project to neoliberalism and towards feminist internationalism. The webinar has been organized by the Gender Studies Network at King's College London, and I would like to ask Phoebe if she could introduce us the network, please.
Hi, thank you. The network is, Gender Studies Network is based at King's, and it's a network of scholars and students whose research or what studies look at gender relations, and it's founded and organized by Jelka Boston, who I think is attending. We run a mailing list and a Twitter account, and this year we've also, as well as the webinars, which replace the sort of in-person seminars we used to do, we've also launched a blog called Feminist Perspectives, which is run by an editorial collective of PhD students, but we're always looking for short research-based pieces. If you've got any of those that you would like to email us, you can find both of those by searching Gender Studies at King's on Google. We should come up. Twitter at Gender Kings.
Okay, just there were some kind of problems with the sounds at the end. Could you repeat again what the last part, please? Phoebe?
Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Oh, I was saying, if you want to find us, can you hear me? Oh no. Can you hear me? This is not good. Sorry, my connection is historically bad. You can find us by searching Gender Studies at King's and or on Twitter at Gender Kings.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
Sorry, I'm going to work on my connection.
Okay, just that's good to know about the Gender Studies Network. So one of the kind of things about the structure of the seminar, we are going to have the presentations of 3 speakers. Each of you are going to have 15 minutes for your presentations. Then we will open the floor to Q&A discussions, questions. You can just kindly invite the audience to write their questions and comments on different presentations. So let's start with Alondra Carrillo. She is a psychologist, feminist militant, and member of the Coordinadora 8 de Marzo, or Feminist Coordinating Assembly 8th March in Chile. She's also a member of the group of Feminist Studies in Chile, and she has recently contributed a chapter to the book For a Feminist Constitution, published by PES Espiral. As a former spokeswoman of the Feminist Coordinating Assembly, Alondra became, along with others, a key voice in placing feminist struggles center stage politics in a nationwide uprising Chile has not seen since the return to democracy in the early 90s. Alondra, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you. I hope I will say things that could be interesting to approach the questions that you asked that are really huge problems of the ways of transforming our reality and the place of feminism there. But in order to do so, I will read something I wrote, and it's basically a review of contemporary history in our country that can help us understand this process. So, as you may well know, Chile is a mining country in southern Latin America. For a long time, with a provincial character granted by its peculiar geographical isolation, our country seemed to stand somewhat at odds with the processes that characterized our region and that marked that experience that was called 21st century socialism. This relatively singular quality of national social life was always underlined by the hegemonic forces of the time. Somehow, our political history in general may well enable us to think of Chile as an extraordinary place, either because of its curious political incursions, being the first country where a project of socialist revolution came to power through elections, or because it was the first country where the battery of economic transformations designed at the University of Chicago was implemented, hand in hand with a generalized annihilation of the popular resistance, and thus becoming the first neoliberal laboratory, or because of the stable and exemplary character of the policies of its transition to democracy, the non-existence of sustained periods of political instability, the robustness of its state, all issues that seem to shape it, as Piñera said a few days before October 18th, a true oasis in the heart of Latin America. The hegemony and deep-rooted popularity of the political parties that took on the task of managing democratic transition, together with the lack of political autonomy of the social sectors that fought for the end of the dictatorship, which could enable them to dispute the conditions of truth, justice, and reparation, it all progressively consolidated the configuration of the transitional regime, a regime that combined the widespread impunity of the crimes of the dictatorship with the global preservation of its fundamental transformations in the economic and political order of the country. The slogan with which the political forces of the Concertación de Partidos por la Democracia defended the option of saying no to Pinochet was the 1988 plebiscite. In the 1988 plebiscite was La alegría ya viene, the joy is coming. And the truth is that after the fall of the dictatorship, for the vast majority of the population, joy never arrived. The feminists, who during the dictatorship had resisted, organized, coordinated, taken to the streets, fought for democracy in the country, in the home and in bed, for a feminism that was socialism and something else, saw how the new official political arena had no place for the power that this movement had developed, and how it seemed that one of the conditions of governance was also to preserve the pillars of the dictatorship's attack on women's autonomy. To get an idea of the magnitude of this attack, also left unpunished, it is enough to bring to mind that the last measure of the dictatorship was established in the Constitution with prohibition and total criminalization of abortion, a matter that the political forces of the transition accepted, just like that. For 30 years, since the end of the dictatorship, the general meaning of this new social order instilled through cruel violence was progressively displayed. Little by little, the social, cultural, organizational, and political consequences of the substantial transformation that our country had experienced were established. An order with the labor movement virtually destroyed and reduced exclusively to collective bargaining at the level of each company, where the word strike appears in the law only in order to prohibit it. An order with a social security system transformed into a system of private individual insurance, which handed over all the workers' saving to private entities that invest and circulate the money in their own capital, while handing out starvation pensions to those who have contributed and giving absolutely nothing to those who have dedicated their entire lives to unpaid care work. An order that imposed privatization and profit on education, along with the permanent dismantling of public education, one that is characterized by the intensification of environmental depredation, and with it, the attack on indigenous communities in resistance by means of a permanent militarization of their territories to favor the advance of the lumber and energy industry. One where the destruction of the conditions of existence of the popular childhood was imposed without counterbalance, relegated to the hell of a national minor system in which only in the past decade, 1,669 children under state custody have died. A country where the unrestrained reproduction of patriarchal violence was installed at all levels, including the naturalization of feminicide, of child abuse in the home, and of sexual harassment in the places of study and work. In the heart of these unbearable conditions, we witnessed the emergence of spots of social and political conflict. Around these conflicts, there began to develop the experience of a struggle of several peoples, of a new, diverse, migrant, precarized, feminized working class. Little by little, in each political conflict, against social environmental destruction, for free public education, for improvements in precarious working conditions, the product of this neoliberal order took shape. A new latent social and political force, not represented by any of the parties that had administered a system that directly threatened its existence. In 2016, the cry from Argentina for ni una menos, not one woman less, met in Chile with an ongoing process of emergent feminist politicization, which was growing in the heat of the student struggle against market education, and which was beginning to push for a non-sexist education in a spontaneous display of consciousness and willingness to mobilize. Many of us met in the street, and a process was inaugurated, the process of the progressive emergence of feminism as a mass movement in Chile, which brought with it a radical critique of an irreducible condition of life in neoliberal Chile, such as patriarchal violence. The long tradition of feminist struggle in Chile provided the conditions for a political exercise that was crucial. As every year, we feminists met to organize the March 8th mobilizations, the International Working Women's Day, which in our country is the first major mobilization every year. In 2018, we prepared to face a second Piñera administration, after building a slogan that was capable of bringing together the living experiences of the mobilizations in the past 30 years. We called ourselves to take to the streets against the precarization of life. A historical and transversal mobilization took place, one that included the voices of migrant, trans, and precarious working women. This determination to turn the March 8th commemoration into a day of protest, socially broad, was linked with the international call for a women's strike, or a feminist strike as it was called in Spain. After taking stock of the day, we made a fundamental political decision. We would work the entire year of 2018 to organize a strike in a country where it was forbidden. We would make this strike a process, one of feminist social organization that would bring together the different struggles of these 30 years, at the same time putting the lives of women and gender dissidents at the center as a political problem. We organized an encounter calling on women organized on various social fronts, collectives, or other small initiatives, or non-organized at all, an encounter of those who struggle. We organized it in order to build a program that would say what we wanted, so that no one else would speak for us. In this encounter, we reached an agreement. We intended that the feminist general strike would be a moment to emerge as a force for transformation and opposition to all the sectors that have administered the neoliberal precarization of life, the political parties of the transition, the businessmen, the church leaders. We also said that we would aim at opening a process of rising mobilization in our country where feminism would have a central place. I emphasize this because I believe that it manages to show with a remarkable historical clarity the intimate link between the great social processes and the organized desires that do not determine beforehand the ideal image of what is wanted, but rather propose the opening of spaces so that our own force finds its way. The revolt, unleashed in October 18th, 2019, happened with a historicity of its own, one that permeated by the diverse exercises of struggle and organization that preceded it, and that gave shape to the historical judgment that unfolded practically since those days. We quickly said that it was not 30 pesos, that relatively small hike in the metro fare, but 30 years. It was the incommensurable quality of life that was at stake there. This revolt was at the beginning pure negativity, and in that sense, it was what my comrade Javiera Mansi says when she highlights the power of the no more, which was what we spray painted on the walls. The no that for feminists is, in the words of Sarah Ahmed, a political labor, was what allowed the opening of a constituent practice that coexisted with the production of a constituent possibility of ourselves, of the people's in struggle, of the horizon of general transformation that we were struggling to be able to give an affirmative name, not just a negative one. To this practical exercise of a popular insurgent historical judgment, the government responded through state terrorism. For the first time in 30 years, the military was once again in the street shooting to kill. Carabineros of Chile, the militarized police, unpunished criminal institution since the dictatorship, once again put in practice its repertoire of violence and its tactics of eye mutilation and blinding people, with buckshot already reaching almost 500 cases, became known worldwide. Under these conditions, a double agreement was signed in our country for social peace and for the new constitution. Social peace that is synonymous with impunity, so that a criminal government that declared war on people can continue with its term, and a new constitution through a two-tier convention made in the image and likeness of a parliament with barely 2% of approval, but with gender parity in the allocation of seats. This will be the first constitution in the world written with gender parity, and is also the first to be written in the midst of a new wave of world feminism. From feminism, as well as from the various social sectors that have been part of this revolt, we have deployed our powers simultaneously at both levels of this historical situation. as a force that struggles against impunity and state terrorism, and as one that strives for that life that is owed to us. We have established the first milestones of our own tradition, and we will soon hold a third encounter of those who struggle in order to face this new moment with our own understanding. We do not know beforehand what is coming in this convulsed scenario of world capitalist crisis, pandemic, and end of the world. The only thing that we know for certain is that this constituent process is much more than the possibility of writing a new constitutional draft. It is a long-term process where, in the heat of the daily struggle against patriarchal violence that runs through us, we'll be able to go on developing the conditions to produce the mass thinking that will challenge the present in new ways, exploring its possibility of being revolutionarily transformed. We feel the historical responsibility to open a way out of the neoliberal crisis that does not reinforce the authoritarian ways of this disastrous present. And without knowing beforehand the form of the future that we desire, we have no choice but to hold the keys to our power as it has manifested itself so far, by broad social deliberation and permanent mobilization, by political autonomy, by the capacity of believing in our own capability of transforming reality and not delegating our hopes and powers in anyone that appears to be authorized to make that change. Nobody's more authorized than us to produce the conditions for changing this reality, and I hope that feminism will be the force that can continue to establish that lesson, because it's what we've learned so far. If we do not fight for ourselves, nobody will. We're alone in this. We only have ourselves to count with. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. It was really inspiring, really interesting to understand this historical approach about where our struggles are coming and how complex there are challenges and complexities that means, and the great opportunities that despite all this context of impunity, we have for the first time the chance to change the course of history in our country. So thank you very much. It was an amazing speech. Thank you. Let's go to our second speaker, Phoebe Martin. She is a PhD student at the UCL Institute of the Americas and affiliate students of King's College London. Her research looks at the new generation of feminism in Peru and the role of artistic, creative strategies within this movement, particularly the phenomenon of artivism. She's particularly interested in transnational feminisms in Latin America and the relationship between social media and visual or artistic forms of activism. Her research is funded by a London Arts and Humanities Partnership studentship. Sorry, that was me. Post. Cancel. Oh my God. Anyway, sorry, Phoebe. That's what was my mobile trying to control you guys. Sorry. Her research is funded by a London Arts and Humanities Partnership studentship, and I'm sure Phoebe's presentation today on feminist movement in Peru will also provide us with more insights to understand the current political situation in the country. Phoebe, it's over to you.
Hi, thank you. I'm speaking through James's account, but it's me. So if that's confusing to anyone, the name below is not me. But I think this should make my connection better so that I'm not blocked by the internet. So today I wanted to talk a bit about sort of the wider feminist movement in Latin America and what this might mean in relation to what is happening in Chile. As you mentioned, my research looks at Peru, and over the last week, we've seen again, historic protests happening in Peru. So it's a moment of extreme parallels between Chile and Peru, but we're still waiting to see what the outcome of those protests will be, because it's evolving minute by minute at the moment. They're still voting on new things. So I'm not going to comment too much on it because it's an evolving situation. But as Alondra has mentioned, since 2015, we've seen an explosion really in feminist activism across Latin America. Well, you could call it a new tide of feminism, which kind of draws on the green tide of abortion rights activism that I will talk about later. This isn't to suggest that there hasn't been feminist activism before 2015, but it didn't have this high profile and wide support base that we see now. So I'm going to talk first about 3 key moments that kind of tie into this feminist reawakening. The first of which is Ni Una Menos, which is a feminist movement that started in Argentina, but has had aftershocks across Latin America. It started in Argentina in 2015 after the murder of a 14-year-old who was found buried under her boyfriend's house, which sparked mass protests. The name Ni Una Menos draws on a face by a Mexican poet and activist, Susana Chavez, and the phrase is Ni Una Muerta Más, but then it was translated into Ni Una Menos, so not one woman less. So we don't want to lose any more women. This also had a huge replica in Peru in 2016, which saw the largest protests in Peruvian history, well, up until the last week, with over 1 million people marching nationwide under the banner of Ni Una Menos. And it became a movement in Peru that is both draws on the Argentinian movement, but is its own separate thing. So we see this thing in transnational feminism of local movements that draw on international movements and transform them to their own context. There were also Ni Una Menos protests in Argentina in 2016, and that created aftershocks across Latin America and in Spain. So it's one of those things, it draws on a wider Latin American feminist context, but it adapts it to local specificities and local cases. The second key event in Latin American feminism I wanted to talk about was the Marea Verde. So this is the tide of activism for abortion rights. It's called the Marea Verde because it draws on the green scarf or pañuelo verde, which starts in Argentina again. So we see a pattern that one of the key countries in this feminist movement is Argentina, but it is not the only place where feminism is happening. The Pañuelo Verde was born in Rosario in Argentina in 2003 at the National Feminist Encuentro there, and it was chosen as a symbol for the national campaign for legal, safe and free abortion. And it was green in particular was chosen because of its lack of ties to traditional social movements. So they thought of purple, but because of its associations historically with feminism, that wasn't chosen. Same for red with left-wing activism. However, now I think you can't really see green without thinking about feminism. When I see a green scarf, it kind of triggers a sense of feminist solidarity. I think one of the major areas of gains that feminists have seen in the last few years has been in the realm of abortion rights. We saw that in Chile in 2017, in Oaxaca in 2019, and came very close in Argentina. And hopefully maybe next year we will see that there. However, these rights are constantly under threat or not present at all. There are still countries where it is illegal in any case, which makes these achievements where they do happen incredibly inspiring. So in the case of Peru, where there are some exceptions, although it is very difficult to access therapeutic abortion, I remember it being hugely inspiring to see what was happening in Argentina and Chile for activists there when I was doing my field work. So on the 28th of May, which is the International Day of Activism for Women's Health, we did a protest outside the Argentine embassy to reinforce our support for their campaign, but also to draw on the campaigns in Argentina for the rights of women to get access abortion in Peru. The Pañuelo Verde is also an interesting example of transnational feminism because while green was originally chosen as the color, there was a time when each country thought of using their own color, and in Peru they were going to choose beige, which I think is a was an odd choice, but now what's happened is actually everyone's seen the power of having a transnational campaign for abortion rights to have the green tide spread across all countries. And then the final example of event that I want to talk about is the Chilean A Rapist in Your Path. So this really ties into what I look at in terms of art-based activism and performance and the use of creativity that draws on the power of social media to put feminist activism on the agenda and center it in politics. So this is, I'm sure most people in this call are familiar with it, but it was a performance that started in Valparaiso and then it spread across Latin America like wildfire to the rest of the world, to India, to Turkey, even to outside the trial of Harvey Weinstein in January 2020. This performance links gender violence to structural violence. It draws on the work of the Argentine feminist theorist Lita Segato, but it also encapsulates some of the key characteristics of Latin American feminism. So transnationalism, because it moves so quickly from country to country through social media, but it also shows an awareness of how feminist struggles are connected to wider struggles against corruption and state violence. I remember seeing it kind of explode through my social media networks. I sort of started seeing it on Facebook and in WhatsApp groups, and immediately there was a sense of, we have to do a version of it here and here and here. And as something that was very easy to replicate because you have to learn the dance and the music, but with beyond that, you can do it wherever. It became something that you could do almost instantaneously. And in Peru, we saw examples all over in cities where there is not often a lot of high-profile feminist activism, and they even did a version in Cusco in Quechua, which reflected on the Mapuche versions in Chile as well, but also the Aymara versions in Bolivia. So I found it a key example of the ways that it can be transformed by local realities, but also still draw on this transnational dimension of feminist activism. So these three examples, throughout those, I've kind of mentioned some of the characteristics of this contemporary feminist movement in Latin America. One of these key things being social media, which has in the recent years has become more and more of a key factor in allowing social movements to happen. This is partly because in a practical sense, internet access has become much more widely spread in Latin America. If we look at internet access between 2000 and 2020 increased by 2,500% across Latin America and the Caribbean. However, we should also remember this is not equally spread in a lot of Central America. Still less than 50% of people have access to the internet. But if we look in the Southern Cone, rates are pretty high. Chile has access of 77% of people have access to the internet, which means that it's a country where it's more likely to play a significant role in how people build and transform social movements. It also shows us, if we look at statistics, the majority of internet users are younger and educated in urban areas, which is mirrored in the way that the protests took place and who can take part in those. And I think we should always remember the way that access to the internet affects who can participate in struggles if they're digitally mediated. But this has been key for feminist activism. I think we can all remember many hashtags, not only Me Too, which is the kind of one that gets mentioned most, but Ni Una Menos, or in the case of abortion, Será Ley. And earlier this year, the campaign that started in Mexico, La Policía No Me Cuida, which I think has been mirrored in other countries where we've seen harsh police brutality against feminist activists, to the evolving practice of a digital escrache, where feminists will out abusers on social media because of the lack of justice in day-to-day life. So social media allows feminists and other activists to harness the potential for virality, but also to translate it into offline moments. So I think in Chile, we see that as a key example of it's happening online, but it's also happening offline at the same time. And it kind of exists in a world that is both, not just one or the other. The other factor, the other sort of characteristic of contemporary feminism is transnationalism or internationalism in the title of this talk. So feminism has long been an international movement. It's not to suggest that there's anything new in Latin America. We've had the encuentros for many, many years, and it's a movement that always draws on this strength. But I think that through social media, these connections have been strengthened because it's much easier to connect to activists in other countries through Facebook or Instagram than it is to travel thousands of miles and pay for a plane to go to an encuentro that happens once every few years. So I think that, as I mentioned before, the example of seeing Un violador en tu camino like spreading so quickly through social media, just literally being able to see it go from group to group and page to page is a key example of how it is so transnational. And then I'll move quicker because I've got 5 minutes. And then the last thing I want to talk about, which draws a lot on what Alondra was saying, is the intersectionality of feminist activism. So I think that in the past, feminist movements had been criticized, I think in Peru but elsewhere, for not taking into account kind of a broader spectrum of perspectives. But now we see the perspectives of minoritized women, indigenous women, Afro-descendant women being prioritized, as well as focusing on the gendered impact of class inequalities. I think it's prioritized in contemporary activism because we know that if we rise, a rising tide lifts all boats, and we should focus on the experiences of women who are suffering the most first. The other thing is that feminist movements have really strong links to LGBTQI movements, especially I see this in Peru particularly, but I think we see this across Latin America. And these are movements that have made historic gains in recent years. So all of this makes feminism one of the strongest areas of civil society in Latin America at the moment, in Chile and also in Peru, which we've seen in the last week. And the links between feminist and leftist movements is a key area of strength for these, and a key area where hopefully we can use that to see transformations. I wanted to finish by looking at the example of abortion rights as a key feminist issue that ties together both neoliberalism and women's rights. As you mentioned, in Chile, it's tied intimately to the constitution. And I think that the example that feminists in Chile have made, the argument that abortion is a neoliberal issue, is something that feminists across Latin America can draw on, and they do. So there's a phrase that's often seen on protest signs that is surviving an abortion is a class privilege. And I think that argument that, because where abortion is effectively illegal, it still happens all the time. All it means is that if you have money, you can pay someone to have a better time and you're less likely to die. But if you don't have as much money, you're more likely to experience dangerous complications. So this shows that abortion is not, although it is fundamentally an issue of bodily autonomy, it is also an issue that's fundamentally tied to neoliberalism. And as we see the impact of neoliberalism in Latin America, we should remember its impact, its particularly gendered impact. And the way that feminists make this argument is central to the possibility for transformation. So I will conclude now. So this reflects the clear link between neoliberal and patriarchal institutions and the ways that these perpetuate gender inequality and attacks on the right to bodily autonomy. The historic referendum in Chile and what happens over the next few years will provide inspiration and pathways for movements across Latin America in a time of economic uncertainty, the ongoing pandemic, and political turmoil across Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you, Phoebe. It was quite interesting, very interesting. And I really like the idea that you emphasized how internationalism and transnationalism has been at the core of the history of feminist movements. And this is one of the things that I want to raise the point before introducing Laura, because from the experience of municipalist movement in Southern Europe, there was also this idea of this political horizon of building translocal networks of solidarity and disputing within the left a notion of internationalism, which is beyond the notion of nation state, which is a very interesting aspect. Perhaps Laura, you can talk more about this in your presentations. I'm going to introduce Laura. She is a researcher and activist currently based at the Basque Country. She works on municipalism, democracy, and feminist practices. She recently published a report and toolkit on feminist practices in the municipalist movement, particularly in Southern Europe. This report was called Feminized Politics Now, and an entry on new municipalism from the Springer Encyclopedia on Educational Innovation. Laura, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. And yeah, thanks, Yvette, for the link. With the previous presentation, I think it's actually great to start there, and it's one of the main issues that I want to focus on today. So, but first, I want to make clear that what I will be sharing today is part of my research, but also part of my activism. So I might sound a bit schizophrenic at times, but that's how it works for me. So I think it's quite natural, but for you to understand what the approach is. So mainly as a starting point, I wanted to say a few things that, of course, will sound also obvious to you, but it's the framework I'm using to explain the points that I want to make, which is what does feminism mean, not simply in terms of the feminist agendas that many of the examples were mentioned before in the two previous presentations, but also what does it mean for the way we do politics, and what does feminism mean for the left, and not simply what does the feminist movement as such have to say, but also how can progressive forces in different places transform themselves and get rid of patriarchal ways of doing politics. Of course, the discussions about feminizing politics have been on the table, especially in political science, but also in other contexts. In Spain, in particular, that's the language that has been used in the last few years to talk about not only gender balance in representation and so on, but also to some of the political practices. But in general, the focus tends to be on political representation, and that is not a problem as such, but the problem is that we're still focusing on the same kinds of institutions that are patriarchal in the same way. And we are trying to use to find more balanced way, more more just ways of doing politics within those institutions. And there's not only that, but also we are in the middle, as you know, of a very deep political crisis where traditional institutions have serious problems reaching ordinary people. People distrust traditional institutions. They are disenchanted with the way politics is done, both with the left and the right. The extreme right is rising partially because of that, because people need to have the feeling that someone is speaking for them and not simply someone far from them talking about things that affect their lives. And the political left seems to be unable to deal with that. So three main strategies seem to be on the table. The first one, going back to traditional leftist strategies, technocratic answers to political problems. The second is leftist populism that is also on the rise in many places, in part as a counter balance to the populist right. And a third one, of course, the traditional but radical left, that usually has the problem of not being able to connect with people who are not already who don't share that kind of political culture that is more radical, more critical. So what I wanted to talk about today is connected to how the municipalist movement, which we could talk a long time about what we mean by that, but mainly about it's a political strategy that aims at building power by starting from the local level, but not simply by winning local elections or by building local, I don't know, co-ops or autonomous alternatives, but it's a political strategy that aims to navigate this space in between institutions and political and social movements, trying to reform institutions and also to connect those institutions with political and social movements by generating new forms of decision making at the local level, starting at the local level and then scaling up and out. This means that this strategy is criticizing the main point of representative politics, which is state-centered democracy that is the focus of our political lives. And many social movements tend to still focus on that framework. Of course, many political parties, the ones that I was mentioning before, even leftist populism, still focuses on those state-centered institutions, and municipalism aims to change that. So there is an affinity between feminism, or some trends within feminism, and this municipalist strategy, because they both aim at changing the way we do politics and not simply the outputs of politics. So looking at how decisions are made, who is making decisions, how people are able to participate, how is privilege determining the way we decide about our lives, and so on. So there is some kind of harmony between these two projects and share agendas, but also it's one of the arguments that has been defended for some time is that it's easier to implement a project of feminizing politics when we start from the local level and then reach out. It's very hard to change nation level political parties, for instance, and so on. So so I guess the point is this, that there's this harmony or shared agenda between these two movements. And I want to talk about this transnational dimension of the work that we're doing in a second, but I will share some of the, first I wanted to share some of the ideas of what we mean by feminization of politics. As I said before, it's not simply about gender balance and so on, it's about changing the ways we do, in which we do politics. This is the report. I'm going to share now the report that Yvette was mentioning before. There we've gathered different practices and discussions that the municipalist movement is having in different places around what it means for them to change the way we do politics. And some of the dimensions that are analyzed there are things like gender balance, of course, but it's just one of the topics. Then the issue of care, democracy, like strong participatory democracy. What does that mean for feminist ways of doing politics? Discussions about power and cooperation. What does it mean to exercise power in a feminist way once you are in power? Also issues like diversity, intersectionality, leadership, and nonviolence, and how to address violence within political organizations. So mainly, as I was saying, as an activist, I'm part of the municipalist movement, and I am part of this network. This is mainly in Europe, where we are different activists from different organizations interested in working around feminism within the organizations. This is a very small network, but what I wanted to say about that is not, so here we are talking about a different form of transnationalism, not the one that was mentioned before of like things happening in different places and then replicating in other places more spontaneously. Of course, it's not spontaneous, but looks spontaneous. But we're focusing more on capacity building and how a network can support the work we are doing in our local organizations. And here, this is not, as I was explaining, it's not a feminist movement in the same way, but it's like we're a bit obsessed with the importance of having feminists thank you, like infiltrated in other kinds of political movements. And the main work that we are doing is supporting feminists within these political organizations to put forward a feminist agenda within those organizations, which is usually very difficult, especially in small organizations that don't have resources and so on. So mainly, we have this group where we develop methodologies and so on in order to support the work to create tools for those organizations, but also to support the people who are struggling within leftist organizations to put forward a more feminist agenda. And as the municipalist movement is organized through horizontal structures, not like traditional political parties where you build local organizations, but then you have you build branches, but then you have bigger organizations that unite all of them at the state level, probably, or regional level, even in some cases. In this case, the idea is to work as networks, and in the same way, the feminists working within the movement are also organized through horizontal networks. So it's not that visible. It's not that it's not that powerful in the traditional way, but it has allowed us to connect with many organizations in many places. Also, and so this is very interesting, we've been sharing experiences and practices with other kinds of organizations, like artists, social movements in different places, also political parties that are not municipalists, but people who want to reflect upon how they do politics. And of course, this is municipalism is not new, but this way of doing municipalism in different parts of the world probably is, and people are exploring, and it's still very small, but still we do believe that it is really important to take that dimension of, to take into account that dimension of which political strategy in the current political system, which political strategy allows us to put forward our feminist goals, and to what extent achieving short-term results like changing policy here and there. Of course, that's important, and it's a matter of lives in many cases, but also at the same time, how to deal with long-term changes, or how to achieve long-term changes in our political systems through an adoption of different political strategies that really distribute power and allow people to cooperate and to be protagonists of key roles in political decision making. And starting by the local level it's probably a strategic there's a strategic reason to do that, but also it's also a matter of principle. If we can't change the way we do politics, there's certain values, that the feminist values, that we cannot implement in our political systems. So and I will leave it here. We can continue the conversation in the questions later. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm still here. I don't know. There was two Yvette Hernandez on the panel, on the audience. I don't know. Anyway, but I'm still here. Thank you so much, Laura, for your thought on the experience of new municipalist movements and feminism, which is, I'm sure, raised a lot of interesting questions in relation to what's going on in Chile, and particularly the relationship between feminist movements and the left. And there's always this kind of tension, permanent tension. And also the key question is from where we can start producing real change, from the local, like producing this kind of scaling process of powering towards the national. So it's really interesting to learn more about the experience of municipalist movements in Europe right now, and the role that feminist movement is having in, triggering the possibility, or at least making the political conditions for having this kind of counter-hegemonic political forces to the right and far extreme right wing that is on the rise in Europe. I don't know, Phoebe, there's a couple of questions. I thought there was one question. The question are coming basically to the chat. There was someone from, it's a kind of comment from Tennis, making comparisons about Turkey. We had similar interruptions and long and hard periods of state emergency. Okay, I have two questions and a contributions. First, my question are, besides gender parity, which is a huge success, are there any feminist red lines or concrete demands which are deemed to take place in the Constitution? I'm sure this is a question for Alondra. Is there any other guarantees institutions to secure gender equal provisions of the Constitution? My contribution is about feminisms and municipalities. In Turkey, an opposition party, HDP, has a policy of equal parity. In the municipalities, they won basically the Kurdish region in southeastern Turkey. They introduced, basically in the municipalities, they won basically the Kurdish region in southeastern Turkey. They introduced co-mayor policy. Now almost all of these municipalities were seized by the government, and women are being persecuted and imprisoned for this policy. I'd like to share further information both for activism and for academic purpose if someone, especially Laura, is keen on. And for you, Phoebe, where we can learn more about your work. So, Alondra, it's over to you.
Yes, I'm sorry if my English is not really fluent when trying to formulate an answer to this difficult question. So the first thing I would have to say is that we're now having this discussion. So it's an open discussion. We do not have a precise answer because, well, I'm part of the Feminist Coordinator March 8th, but there's a lot of feminist organizations that are looking forward to intervene in the convention. And we have decided recently to go and dispute our presence there. Yesterday, in fact, but what we may call red lines will be defined by the political coordination and strategic elaboration that we will be able to make with several feminist organizations. But the first thing I would like to say is that for us, it was really important to challenge what we mean when we say feminist issues. So, of course, you can say that erasing the parts of the Constitution that, I don't know, establish the sacred character of the unborn is, of course, a feminist issue and a red line. Of course, erasing the place of the family as the pillar of the social order is another red line for us, of course, but also to guarantee the housing is the feminist issue for us, and it has to be it has to take place in the writing of the new constitution now, because if we want to eradicate gender violence at home, first we have to have a home to live in. First, women have to have roofs over their heads that are theirs, and that give them the security of having their own place and not depending on a man's wage or a man's housing to be able to escape the circle of violence, or also eradicating the pension system that we have currently in our country is a feminist issue, because the capitalization, the individual capitalization is mainly an institution consecrated by the Constitution that only recognizes work when it is paid work, and does not recognize the work of taking care of others in a non-paid way. No, it does not recognize unpaid labor as labor. So, of course, that is also a feminist issue. And that is also a red line, because it's what we have been fighting for over these last 5 or 7 years or so. So I think that will be one of the most interesting political process that will occur here. And it is that we will be able to redefine practically and historically what we mean by feminist politics and by feminist issues. And also there's another thing that is now like mainstream, as if as one of the demands of the feminist movement, that is the recognition of reproduction work or reproduction labor that it's performed in the house, domestic labor. And what we have said over these last few years is that recognition is not enough. No, what we need is socialization of that work. What we need is a care system that is public, that is publicly organized, and to recognize or also pay for the women that do that work does not transform the lives of those women, and does not transform the relations that shape us in our lives. So that will also be a dispute. Now, where to trace that line will be a result of the capability of the feminist movement to transcend fetishized notions of what we're aiming for. Because what we're aiming for is not just equality on the managing of the precarization of life. What we want is equality in the process of radically transforming what exists and creating something new. would be my answer.
Thank you very much, Alondra. It was a very good point, and actually it made me think about one of the seminars organized, conversations talk organized by the Coordinadora 8 de Marzo on feminist constituent powers and constitutional experiences across Latin America. And when you raised the point about what we meant by feminist issues, make me think about that the main dispute right now in the current process, a constituent process to have a new constitution, is how we are going to address the question of gender in that constitution. It's not just about numbers, parity, it's addressing the political questions about gender and women. It's the political question about feminist issues also, which is quite a big dispute, honestly. Phoebe, what would you like to say about your questions on where we can find more information on your work, which is quite interesting also in relation to when we see what's going on in Chile and other countries, particularly during the lockdown, how the art activism continue being, present during lockdown and curfew and state of emergency.
Yeah, definitely. There was a really interesting campaign that they did in Peru where people took photos of themselves with the phrase "harta", so I'm tired of, written on their bodies, and of different things that they were tired of, mostly that they were using the ongoing campaign in Peru, which is Perú País de Violadores, or Perú País Feminicida. So like, they had all these things. They continued to use the online space for that. In terms of where you can find out more about my work, I'm still writing it up because I'm in the final year of my PhD. So it's all currently in that process, but you can email me and I'll put a link to a blog post I wrote recently there, but there's not much published yet because I'm still writing it. So at the moment it's not in a very concrete form, but you can email me if you have any particular questions. Oh, not that. Yeah, there's a blog that I've posted in the chat that I wrote recently. I actually had a question for Alondra, if no one in the chat has any questions.
Sorry, I was on mute, I didn't realize. But yes, I also have a couple of questions for the audience, for the panelists. But go ahead, Phoebe.
I just wanted to know what was the relationship between feminist movements and leftist movements like in the process, because one of the problems in Peru is that the left is extremely fragmented / non-existent. So that's one of the main issues that's happening right now, is although there's huge public opposition to Congress and everything they're doing, there's not really a place from which to organize that in the way that I saw it seemed to be happening in Chile. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that.
Yes, I was wanting to say something about what you presented, so I'll try to connect both, because I kept thinking about the idea of intersectionality and the way it appears to us as a way of what we put forward and what we pay the most attention to, and thus trying to overcome the inherent tendencies of not seeing or being blinded by the different oppressions that constitute what we are. But I believe that one of the key things that we have done here is seeing the matter of class in a different statute that of gender or race or colonial violence, because the very idea of class inequalities has a content that does not really consider the fact that what we are experiencing now in the revolt and with the feminist movement is the actualization of a class struggle. That's what I think. Not just the fighting for overcoming inequalities, but to challenge a way of the antagonizing interests that keep the world as it is, or our country as it is. What we saw in the plebiscite of the referendum of October 25 is only 5 comunas, I don't know how to say that, neighborhoods, voted against the change of the constitution, and those comunas are, or neighborhoods or districts, are the richest. No? But they're not only the richest because they have money, they are the richest because they own everything. The land, the sea, the pension system, the health care system, the educational system. They own almost everything in the country, and what they do not own, well, other people from around the world own. So that is important, because if we say left today as a social movement, not only as the identification, the self-identification of the people organized in little political organizations, or even as parties. When we say left is feminism, like historically. The only massive now, it not all the time, not inherently, not by nature, but now. Well, when we say the organization from below, the opening of historical processes of building the strength to be able or be capable of presenting strategic problems for social transformation that contribute to the to giving birth to a project of social transformation that is feminism now in Chile. So it's hard, because when we say left in our country, we of course do not imagine feminism. We imagine other things. I don't know, the political forces that sold the country in the last 30 years. Those are considered left, left organizations, or the bureaucrats in the unions that have administered the class conflict over the last 30 years without making any change, or without having any political will of transforming that conditions that even I don't know, limit their own possibilities of developing into something else. The Central Única de Trabajadores, the I don't know how to say that, but the main union that gathers together all the little unions, that is thought of as left. I don't know what is left in that left anymore. So it's, as you may understand from what I'm saying to you, the political relation is tense because what we're saying is not something nice to hear for men that have been all these years thinking that they are the left and they are the ones that are I don't know how to say this word, están llamados a, I don't know, Yvette, if you can help me.
The call to be the main enlightened people.
Yeah, the new Lenins or so. I don't know. There's no new Lenin in our country. If anything, it would be a group of diverse women wondering what the hell we can do, to keep this moment open. So I know it's just a partial response, because we could address several other issues that come into place when we think of the left and the organized labor movement or so. But I believe this is one of the most important keys to understanding the need for not thinking of the left and feminism as two things that relate to each other, but as a process of transformation of the subject of the left itself.
That is a very interesting point. And actually, if I may, I'm going to raise a question for you three guys, because I've been following a lot of discussions in Latin America and also here in the UK. And one of the things is that I'm going to put this in context. When I was following a debate about the constituent process and the constitution in Chile right now after the referendum, there was a very interesting discussion, previous to the referendum, there was a very interesting discussion by someone who said, in Chile, we have been able to develop a bloc against neoliberalism because of the almost 20 years of the struggles, particularly from the student movements and workers' movements, teachers' movements, and now feminist movements. But we don't have the same level of analysis and critique against capitalism, which is different. And I thought about the concept of class struggle, which I think is quite interesting, how the feminist movement in Chile is trying to reappropriate and dispute from the left. So I'm just wondering, how is your understanding of this concept in contexts like Spain? Well, here in the UK, there is a lot of traditions about talking about working class people and class struggles. I'm more coming from Chile. I was surprised, living in Spain before moving to the UK, I was surprised that it's a kind of very strong narrative, particularly in sectors on the left with Corbynism before 2019. But how do you understand this dispute by feminism in terms of class struggle? If you can share with us your experience from very different contexts. Laura, if you want, you can be the first.
Okay, big question. Yeah, I guess, I don't know. It's a complex question, and the answer needs to be complex. I think one of the main issues is that I think feminism, not all the strands of feminism, but many people have been questioning precisely the simplicity of the understanding of where the problem is, right? Where's our problem? Is the problem matter of class, and that's it. So I think that the understanding at least in Spain, which is the context I know better, is that relationships of privilege, oppression, domination are not simply a matter of material resources, but also other kinds of resources that cannot be understood in terms of having something, but more in terms of how we relate to others. And this affects, of course, the way we understand struggles, but also inequalities and so on. There's certain things that cannot be appropriated and taken from, like, it's not either I have it and you don't, but it's how we relate with each other. And also this is closely connected to the discussions about power and about what power means from a feminist way, right? Is it a matter of having something and taking something from you, or is it a matter of how we collaborate and build more strength together? I think at least here the feminist the feminist movement is questioning those kinds of simplifications of reality. And it doesn't mean that class is not relevant, but class is not the original variable. I mean, it's not the independent variable here. It's not class is generated by other kinds of elements. And also, I think the focus is shifting from a matter of distribution and a matter of material resources to a matter of relationships, and which kinds of relationships we work in when we are embedded in. I think that's so if the question is how feminism is reinterpreting this, I think this is more or less what's happening here. And this is precisely one of the reasons why we are also focusing on how we do politics, because it's key to understanding who's running the show, right? It's not simply about what is being done, but who is doing what, and how do those people relate to the rest of the people in our societies. I mean, why do some people have the decision-making power over some others, which is not connected to class in many cases. I mean, it's not the richest, the ones who make stupid decisions on many occasions, but just, I don't know, people who have other kinds of privileges, and that's also something that we need to address in addition to material inequalities. So it's a matter also of sharing decision-making power and changing and creating new kinds of relationships that are more healthy and that are more egalitarian in a deeper sense and more complex sense.
Thank you. Phoebe, I don't know if you wanted to address this from the perspective of your own research, what you have seen in Peru. And of course, I mean, Alondra already in many ways prompted the question through this idea of disputing this meaning of class struggle on the left by the feminist.
Yeah, it's an interesting example in Peru because unlike, I think, in the case of Chile or Argentina or Spain, there is the left wing in Peru is incredibly fragmented at best. So in the last week, I've been trying to sort of track what's been happening because it's all exploded very quickly and got very violent very quickly. And now they had this new usurper president, but he's now left. And now they're trying to find a new temporary president to sit between now and the scheduled elections in April. And so this is all based on last night, me being on Twitter. But I think it's an interesting illustration of this problem. So one of the few Congress people who didn't vote to eject the previous president at this point was a high-profile feminist, and she was proposed as she's a feminist and she's a leftist, and she was proposed as a possible sort of caretaker president between now and April, but she was rejected on the grounds of both being a feminist and a leftist. And I think there's a real the struggle for feminists in Peru is, in terms of articulating a feminist leftist vision of the world, is that there is a lot of negative reaction to the idea of leftist politics because of the history of Peru. So because of the Sendero being a communist organization, as soon as you mention the left, there are people who even now will say, oh, well, if you're a leftist, you're a terrorist. So there's the verb in Spanish of terruquear, which means to call someone a terrorist. And basically, especially online, which is not always the best place to articulate these things, as I'm sure people know from Twitter, but as soon as you mention being leftist or even just mention being a feminist, people start calling you a terrorist. So even though this current crisis is articulated by the right, it's very hard to find a space to articulate a leftist opposition. So it creates a very difficult landscape for feminists to navigate, because I think most feminists understand that capitalism is one of the things that you have to dismantle in order to create a properly feminist future, but it's very hard to articulate that in the context of Peru. But I think that hopefully looking at the pathways carved by activists in Chile and Argentina will maybe provide some narratives to follow, but it's a very difficult context for feminists in terms of articulating an anti-capitalist vision.
That is really, really interesting. I'm just I was writing something to the attendees. If then someone prefer writing your questions in Spanish, that's fine. We can translate. But yeah, definitely the floor is still open to questions for Alondra, Phoebe, and Laura. I have another questions in terms of understanding, for example, one of the key things that Las Tesis posed in 2019 was the idea that the state is the first rapist, is the first key actor in, avoiding our freedom. And we see right now what's going on everywhere, thinking about what's going on, for example, in Poland. That's so evident in terms of, the state being the first main key actor in undermining women's rights and women's freedom. But right now, in the context of the COVID-19, one of the things that I learned is how this could be also represent an opportunity to feminist movement to put life center stage of politics. And I always remember when I was looking on Twitter and I found a very interesting projection on a building, was in Spanish was no volveremos a la normalidad porque la normalidad era el problema. We won't return to normality because normality was a problem. And when the COVID happened and it started with lockdowns everywhere, the main slogan by many governments was, we are now in lockdown because we were going back to normality, etc., etc. Right now, with the possibility of having a vaccine, there's against this kind of movement pushed forward by governments about, with the vaccine, we can just go back to normality. How have been the feminist movements in countries like Spain struggling, or in Chile is quite clear in terms of, the feminist movement as a key force. In the case of Peru, for example, how has been struggling against this narrative of, no, we are not getting back to normality because normality was the problem. Laura, Phoebe, Alondra, if you wanted to say more at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I can say anything new, and probably I think, to my knowledge at least, that the discussions have been quite similar in many countries around these issues, right? I mean, the most obvious thing being how much, so to what extent, especially during the lockdown in different places, suddenly we knew that, but many people who didn't know that became aware of the enormous amount of care work that was being done in our societies. So that's the first one. The second, how to what extent we depend on each other for anything we do. I mean, we can't isolate from others, and this is also connected to what I was saying before about relationships. It's not simply about what we have, but how we relate and we depend from others. And then also a third one, to what extent our states simply ignore certain people in our society as if they didn't exist. Here in Spain, it was really interesting to what extent in the first responses by the central government, of course, in addition to centralizing power and making decisions that are not democratic and have no legitimacy, understandable to some extent, but the first decisions and for many weeks, there were groups of population who weren't even spoken about. Like, no one spoke about what to do with children. No one spoke about what to do with homeless people, what to do with, I don't know, health workers that were under a lot of pressure and so on, like assuming this this simplified view of the world where you can just produce norms and the society can act accordingly, right? Ignoring the complexity of our relationships and our dependencies from each other, and the fact that we are people living in bodies that need certain things to live. So I don't know, I think at the beginning it was quite dramatic. So to what extent this became very obvious. I mean, and there were discussions that people didn't have before that starting happening in the first, especially during the first 2 months of the crisis. But at the same time, I don't have the feeling that anything changed just because we became aware of that. At least the policies that are being implemented are not addressing the key issues that became very obvious, like as Alondra was mentioning before, like I don't know, issues like housing and things like that became very obvious during the crisis, and also connected to gender issues, and here nothing special happened in terms of housing. So how of course it's very obvious, like how can you lock down people in houses if they don't have a house, or if they cannot pay the rent? They don't have a job now because they lost it, but they still need to pay the rent every month, and they are required to stay at home, and things like that. So I think from a feminist perspective, it's very obvious and very I don't know. I think it has strengthened the importance of some feminist claims that were on the table, but some people were not realizing about before. But at the same time, I don't think there's any real change around that. At least not from the state in the case of Spain. Perhaps in the case of local governments, things have been different because they are the ones who are dealing with most of the complexities of the crisis and dealing with the everyday of like having people with no houses and dealing with public transportation and finding buildings for new health facilities and so on, and dealing with this in a more complex way, and also in some cases in a more feminist way. But I don't think we realized that we had a problem, but I'm not sure to what extent using the same tools that we already had, like strong centralized states, is able to address those problems differently, because simply it's a machine that doesn't work for that. It's not able to process that complexity.
Thank you. Phoebe, do you have any points there about this concept of normality? And I think, as I mentioned before, how important was art during lockdown times to continue being mobilized in a different way, for example, in the case of Peru?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think the idea of normality is a funny one, because one of the things that happened in Peru at the beginning of the lockdown is they tried to create this system of gendered days, so men could go out on one day and women could go out on one day. And this is a basically disastrous policy, and was I think it lasted less than a week because everyone realized that it was a bad idea for a number of reasons, because it meant that in a practical sense, on the days where women were allowed to go out, the queues for supermarkets were about 5 hours long, and the days that the men went out, they were 30 minutes. But also it had a lot of violent impacts on trans people. So for example, trans women who went out on Women's Day would then face a lot of police repression, because they were meant to do it based on identity cards, and there's no gender identity law in Peru, so they couldn't change it. So even though the president said that it should be done based on identity, it created a lot of problems. So yeah, that was a very strange policy. And so that kind of ties to the idea of they were trying to create, I don't know, was a sense of normality. It's not really a sense of normality. It was very surreal to try and do this, which obviously didn't work. And they gave up on that very quickly because it was a disaster. But I think in terms of using art to continue normality, I think that was definitely, for feminists, I think it's definitely a way of continuing to build those networks of solidarity, is to continue to try and do some form of protest. I think we've seen lots of new examples of protest through quarantine, one of which being projections onto buildings, as you mentioned before. And there's been a lot of that recently in Peru. A kind of resurrection of old forms. So you have a cacerolazo, like the banging of pots and pans, and then the use of social media. So the posting of, I think this campaign that I mentioned before of we're tired of estamos hartas de was a clear example of how you can use social media in quarantine to flood people's feeds with these images and create a network of solidarity using art in quarantine. And lots of groups were doing things like Zoom series or online parties, online conversations to kind of maintain that, as we've all been trying to do. But at the same time, acknowledging that, yeah, the system that we had before is what got us into this mess. I think kind of one of the places that's most true is Peru, as one of the countries that's been worst affected, not only in Latin America, but worldwide. So even though they tried to implement a form of lockdown, it doesn't really work. Like, as Laura said, if people don't have homes, if they can't pay the rent, if they earn their money day to day, you can't ask someone to work from home if their work is selling in a market. That doesn't work over Zoom. So I think that, but now with the new political crisis, we will see it's a very unstable moment.
Thank you. I mean, it's again this idea of, you know, houses becoming factory, and with more different kind of oppression for women, particularly because it's not just about doing work for those who could afford staying at home, but, you know, going back to the 50s, basically, for many of us. Alondra, I know that one of the key, and this is of course a kind of cross-cutting issue is for feminist movement, was how to continue being mobilized when you were in lockdown. We have the experience in Chile that, you know, after the October 18th, the government basically imposed a state of emergency, curfew. People were on the street, in the neighborhoods, meeting, protesting. But lockdown changed the dynamic. How challenging it was for the feminist movement in Chile to continue with this wave of mobilizations and momentum during the lockdown?
It was really hard. What we did was organize a feminist emergency plan, coordinating our efforts in order to come up with a declaration of what we thought was needed to approach this crisis situation in a feminist perspective. And that included orientations to neighborhoods to confront the intensification of gender violence within the homes, creating a network that is called En Red Nos Cuidamos, we take care of each other in networks. I don't know how to translate that, but it's a structure for referencing the initiatives that can help women and children in situations of gender violence. And we continue to to develop ways of protesting from the house, cacerolazos, or projecting images on the walls and so, but it was really not the same, because the isolation that women experience in the home, although we are connected through these social media and stuff, the isolation is it's impossible to undo. You cannot overcome that. So of course it's been different from a few months now, because we are now taken to the streets again and overcoming the fear and the fear of getting sick, and the fear of the military and the police, both. So what we tried to do was, in that period of time where we really couldn't be able to get out, was to hold the question. That's what we aim for, hold the question. What can we do? And continue to ask it within ourselves. Of course, we kept the online meetings and stuff, but it was mostly to approach the question yet and again, because it was the main, the very act of thinking together, of wondering together about the same thing, that kept us linked socially. I don't know if I'm being able to explain what I'm trying to say here, but it's like a vital sustain of life is the fact that we are in this together, although we are isolated from each other and we cannot meet and encounter each other, but we are experiencing the same political issue. So I wanted to say something about normality, because I think what Laura said is really, it's really important. Knowledge isn't power, in a sense. I mean, you can know what is happening, and that does not change the fact that it is happening, and that is life. No? But I believe that what the slogan captured was not so much as a knowledge, but an experience, because when we first organized the feminist strike, what we said was that the feminist strike was going to be an interruption of normality. That's the way we described it. And one of the ways in which that interruption of normality took place was with the intervention of the metro network. I don't know if you remember, but we changed the names of the metro stations together, all at once. Normality is also that, no? The names of the streets or of the stations that we go to every day, and so it's what I'm trying to say with that, it's that for us it was important not only to acknowledge the fact that normality was the problem, but to having the experience of defying that normality. I believe that's what was so potent about what started the revolt, because of course it's part of the normality of life getting worse every day, that the metro fare has like this hike. But what is defying that normality is saying we will not accept this, and we will jump the turnstile. And suddenly the experience of defying that normality was contagious, and it I don't know, it opened something, a field of possibilities that was not there before, that was created by what we did, and that was that configured by the action of defying that heavy normality that shapes the the very form of our emotions and affections, and so the possibility of thinking about what we can do together. Yeah.
Thank you, Alondra. This is a really interesting point. It made me think about something that Laura mentioned before, that sometimes the lack of capacity on the left to connect with daily life. And for example, when you mentioned this action and changing the name of different metro stations, changing the routines, and making or creating the possibility that people think, who was Elena Cafarena, or who was this woman that was changed, that has different name today on the metro station, things like that, which is really interesting. This idea of, connecting politics with daily life, political action with daily life. This was really amazing. Made me think about this idea of changing normality through what we experience every day, not just from the macro political analysis of neoliberalism, etc. Laura, you have a question.
Yes, it was a question for Alondra. You were mentioning before some of the examples that you imagine for the new constitution in terms of, well, it was in terms of red lines, but I guess my question is a bit broader, like which kinds of, if any, which kinds of proposals or discussions are there on the table in terms not only of the more substantive part of the constitution, but also in terms of the structures and the procedures of, so I don't know, the Chilean constitution, I don't know if it's like divided into two parts like other constitutions. Okay, yeah, so for this other like institutional part of the constitution that regulates how centralized your country is, how much power do some people have, competencies, resources, and things like that, electoral system, and things like that. I know it's not a very common place for feminists to dive in, but it sometimes is, and in any case, I think it's really relevant, like how, like who has the who decides, right? Of course, we are simply talking about the formal power, not those who have other kinds of power. But are there any ideas in that domain, or is, I mean, I imagine this is an ongoing discussion, but or can you say anything about that?
Yes. No, but because this has not, it's really interesting, and I've thought of this, of course, with a little bit angst, because people that have been part of the uprising are not thinking about that dimension, because all the content of the mobilizations is in the other dimension, that of life, and how what's the life that we want, and that's the question that we're asking ourselves. So this other part that will be, I believe, I don't know, really co-opted by the established forces. It's something that we have not quite addressed, and I don't know if we will. Because of course there's some things. We have a bicameral Congress. Of course, we have to have a unicameral Congress. That will be something important. The plurinational character of the state. That will be something important, to recognize the statute of nations of the indigenous people. That will be important. What I said before, it's about the place of the family is part of that, or it's now the first article of the Constitution, in fact. But I think that dimension of the Constitution will mostly capture the capacity of the political constitute powers to reorganize the character of the state. And that will not change substantially, because that's not the terrain in which the consciousness that we are producing is developing. And I don't know if you can like deliberately change that. Of course, we will try, and we will have the encounter, and we will discuss, and yeah. But there's also a political tension, because we can really get caught in that. We can really get caught in discussing a terrain that it's mostly configured by what authorized people can say. Like it's a mostly technical arena in that sense. And I don't know, I think the challenge will be to translate what we are now thinking about in the terms of substantial transformation of conditions of life into some key aspects of the character of the state. We are not fighting for the state. And in a way, it cannot end there. So what I think we need to do is to operate that translation in terms that can help us prevent the most dangerous pathways that can be established now, because we have a constitution that is born in dictatorship, and of course this one will not be born in that condition, but it will be born in a condition that is also challenging and also terrible. Now we have state terrorism, and we have also a global situation of authoritarian ways of coming out of this global crisis. And I believe that the least and the most that we can do is try to prevent such a pathway to be traced by the new constitution.
Thank you, Alondra. I mean, we have 3 minutes left, and before finishing, I would like to invite you, if you wanted to comment or just some closing remarks about this webinar. But before that, I want to read something that wrote Adrian in the chat, and she said, as an older feminist in Ireland, I'm re-inspired by all your presentations. Thank you. So interesting and hugely educational from all perspectives, social, political, and feminist. She left before, but she said, I hope you can keep these discussions going. And this is the idea that I want to link about this webinar, was meet each other, but also think about how we can continue building this idea of a new feminist internationalism. So I don't know if you wanted to say something before closing, finishing with the webinar. Phoebe, Laura, Alondra.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for the invitation. It's been very inspiring. I think sometimes, especially in the world the way it is, we spend a lot of time by ourselves and we don't get to necessarily be with other people and share ideas like we would. So it's always nice to kind of be reminded of the connections that you have and that you can build upon to create all the things that we've been talking about in this panel. And it's been, like Adrian says, re-inspiring.
Laura, Alondra, you want to say something?
I'd like just to say thank you, and yeah, it was a great discussion.
I want to say something. I want to say that we're really inspired about what's going on in Chile, and we are following the news also in Peru. And we're all also following the news in the rest of the world about, coronavirus and everything. Just to say, take care there, and I'm really inspired by you guys for the struggle and learning from you. I'm sure that the feminist movement in Chile is going to provide many lessons for other feminist movements around the world, how we can overcome an authoritarian constitutions through more democracy and through more feminist democracy also. This was also key in this webinar. So thank you, everyone. Yeah.
I wanted to also say thank you. I think I learned a lot by learning to you both, and to you also, Yvette. And it was really challenging, the questions that you asked. And I hope that I think we can continue this dialogue later.
Thank you so much, guys, and take care, and see you soon. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, the audience. Bye-bye.